The Arizona desert didn't care who died. It baked the blood into the dust and let the sun bleach the bones white. It watched without judgment as the smoke curled up from the shattered wagons, twisting into the merciless blue sky like ghosts finally giving up. This was Devil's Canyon, a place that earned its name 100 times over, and today was just one more tally mark. The gunshots had echoed at dawn, a sharp, ugly sound that ripped through the morning calm. Now, there was only silence, broken by the buzz of flies and the lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead, waiting for the living to finish their business so the dead could be his. Down below, amidst the carnage, a shadow moved. She flowed between the twisted mesquite and the pale green Palo Verde trees, her deerskin moccasins making no sound on the rocky earth. Her name was Iana, and she was Apache. The scent of gunpowder and blood, a smell her people knew all too well, filled her lungs. This was the work of men, violent men. She crouched behind a sun-split boulder, her dark eyes scanning the wreckage. A wagon train, probably bound for the promised lands of California, had met its end here. 12 wagons, filled with hopes and dreams, now lay like broken toys. Bodies were strewn everywhere, men, women, children, sprawled in the awful, unnatural poses of sudden, violent death. But her people had not done this. The tracks in the dust told a story she could read as easily as a shaman reads the spirits. These were shod horses, not the unshod ponies of the Apache. These were the heavy prints of white men's boots. The bullets buried in the dead were from rifles her people did not carry. This was a massacre, yes, but it was a lie wrapped in the skin of a truth. Bandits, most likely. White bandits preying on their own kind, using the fear of the Apache as their shield. She could leave. She should leave. The white eyes, the Pindalikoyi, had brought nothing but pain to her land. Their soldiers hunted her people like animals, their promises were dust on the wind, their treaties were lies written on paper that burned as easily as a dry leaf. Her own younger brother had been taken by the coughing sickness their people brought, a plague that left a hole in her heart that never truly healed. Helping them would be a betrayal of that memory, a betrayal of her own tribe. And then she heard it. A whimper, soft, terrified. It came from behind an overturned Conestoga wagon, its canvas cover ripped to shreds. Iana went still, patient as the canyon stone itself. She waited. Another sound drifted on the hot air, a man's voice, low and desperate, trying to offer a reassurance he clearly didn't feel. Life. Somewhere in that field of death, a flicker of life persisted. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to melt back into the hills and let the desert claim what was left. Her chief, the great Cochise, would call her a fool. Her warriors would call her a traitor. To help the very people who were trying to erase her own was a madness she couldn't afford. But the whimper turned into a sob, the sound of a terrified child, and it cut through her resolve like a sharp obsidian knife. It was a sound that knew no tribe, no race, no politics. It was the sound of a heart breaking. And Iana found she could not walk away. Not yet. Thomas Brennan gritted his teeth, pressing a wadded-up piece of cloth against the slick, hot blood seeping from his shoulder. The pain was a living thing, a fire that licked up his neck and down his arm. But he couldn't show it. He couldn't scream. He had to be strong for them. His 5 children. His entire world, now huddled behind a heavy wooden chest, their small faces streaked with dirt and tears. The attack had been a whirlwind of pure terror. They had just been breaking camp at first light, the smell of coffee and bacon just starting to fill the air. Then, riders thundered down from the canyon rim, bandanas hiding their faces, guns blazing without a word of warning. It was over in 10 minutes. 10 minutes to shatter a lifetime. His wife, Martha, lay 20 yards away. He had seen her fall, a flower cut down in the middle of a step as she tried to reach for their youngest. He forced himself to look away from her still, silent form. To look at her was to break, and if he broke, they would all die. He focused on the living. 12-year-old Rebecca, his brave, serious eldest, clutched baby Samuel to her chest. Her face was a mask of forced calm, but her eyes were wide with a horror no child should ever see. The twins, Johnny and Jaime, only 8 years old, clung to each other behind a splintered water barrel, their knuckles white, and 10-year-old Grace, his sensitive, quiet girl, was pressed against his good side, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Pa?" Rebecca's voice was a ghost of a whisper. What do we do now?" Thomas risked a glance at his wound. The bleeding was slowing, but a deep, chilling weakness was spreading through him. The bandits had taken everything. The horses were gone, either shot or driven off. Their water was spilled out in the dust. The food was scattered and trampled. The nearest town was a 3-day walk across a hostile, unforgiving desert. For a healthy man, traveling alone, it was a death sentence. For a wounded man with 5 small children, it was a joke. We'll figure something out, Becky," he stammered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. And that's when he saw her. She seemed to materialize from the rocks themselves, a spirit of the canyon, an Apache woman. She wore a traditional deerskin skirt and blouse, intricately decorated with beads that caught the morning sun. Her long black hair was braided with feathers and silver ornaments. A long knife was sheathed at her hip, and she held a rifle with an ease that spoke of constant, familiar use. Thomas's blood ran cold. He instinctively shoved his children further behind the chest. They had survived the white bandits only to be found by the very people they'd been taught to fear most. This was it. This was the end. The Apache woman stopped about 30 feet away, her eyes, dark and unreadable, moving over them. She took in his wound, the terrified children, the desperation that must have been written all over his face. He could see the calculation in her gaze, the same calculation he was making. Could he fight? Could he protect them? He knew the answer was no. "You are hurt," she said. Her voice was not the harsh cry he expected. It was calm, with a musical lilt, and her English was careful, deliberate. Thomas blinked, his fear-addled mind struggling to process the moment. He had braced for war whoops and a final brutal charge, not a conversation. We weren't looking for trouble," he managed to say, his own voice sounding weak and pathetic. A flicker of a smile, bitter and knowing, touched her lips. "Trouble has already found you, white man." She took a step closer. He tensed, his hand instinctively moving to shield his children, a useless, pathetic gesture. She ignored it. As she drew nearer, he could see her eyes were sharp, intelligent. They looked at his wound with a professional assessment, not a predator's glee. "The bullet passed through," she said, more to herself than to him. "No bone was hit. You will live, if the rot does not set in." The children stared at her, their wide eyes a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate curiosity. "You cannot stay here," she stated, her gaze sweeping over the massacre site. "The smell of death will draw predators, 2-legged and 4-legged both." Thomas struggled to his feet, the world swaying dangerously around him. "We're grateful for your concern, but we can't go anywhere. The children will die in the desert," she finished for him, her tone blunt, devoid of pity. "As will you, with that wound, no horse, and no water." It was Rebecca who spoke next, her small voice cutting through the tension. Are you going to kill us?" The Apache woman's gaze shifted to the girl. She looked at Rebecca's hair, the color of sun-ripened corn, and her eyes, blue as a winter sky. For a fleeting moment, a shadow of some old pain passed across the woman's face, a memory too sharp to be held. "If I wanted you dead, child," she said softly, "you would already be dead." "Then what do you want?" Thomas demanded, his fear giving way to a raw, desperate need for an answer. That was the question, wasn't it? What did this woman want? Revenge for the endless wrongs done to her people? Justice for the land and the lives that had been stolen? Or was it something else entirely? Something he couldn't possibly comprehend? She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes following the lazy circles of the vulture high above. It seemed to be waiting for her decision, too. "My camp is half a day's walk from here," she said finally, her voice betraying nothing. "You can rest there. I will tend to your wound. When you are stronger, I will guide you to the soldiers' fort." Thomas stared at her, stunned into silence. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It didn't make any sense. The world he knew was built on a simple, brutal truth. White man and Apache were enemies. They killed each other on sight. There was no middle ground. "Why?" he choked out. "Why would you help us?" The woman looked away from the vulture and met his gaze. Her eyes were deep, ancient pools of sorrow and strength. "My name is Iana," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It means eternal blossom. My mother chose it because she hoped I would always find a reason to bloom, even in the harshest of seasons." She held his gaze, a silent challenge passing between them. "What is your name, wounded man?" "Thomas. Thomas Brennan. These are my children. Rebecca, Grace, Johnny, Jaime, and baby Samuel." Iana nodded slowly, her eyes touching on each child as he said their name, committing them to memory. "We will gather what supplies remain," she announced, her tone shifting back to one of command. "Then we will leave this place of death. The little ones should not have to see any more than they already have." As if on cue, a coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry a stark reminder of where they were. A new thought, colder and more terrifying than any before, slid into Thomas's mind. She wasn't saving them from the desert. She was leading them somewhere else, to her camp. He looked at her rifle, at the knife on her hip, at the hard, unreadable expression on her face. He had no choice but to trust her. But as they began to gather the scraps of their former lives, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just traded one executioner for another. The desert was a furnace. The sun beat down on them, relentless and cruel. Thomas leaned heavily on a crude crutch Iana had fashioned from a broken wagon axle, every step sending a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder. The children trudged along, a miserable, silent little group, their faces smudged with grime and grief. Iana moved ahead of them, a tireless, hawk-eyed scout. She had salvaged what she could from the wreckage: 2 small barrels of water, a sack of dried beans, a few blankets, and, most importantly to her, a box of ammunition that fit her rifle. It wasn't much. It was everything. Rebecca, trying so hard to be the mother they had lost, carried a fussy baby Samuel. The twins, Johnny and Jaime, stayed so close to Thomas they were practically tripping him. Only Grace seemed to have any attention for their strange savior. She kept watching Iana, her initial fear slowly being replaced by a child's unwavering fascination. During a brief rest in the sliver of shade offered by a towering saguaro, the questions started. "Is she really gonna help us, Pa?" Johnny whispered, his eyes fixed on Iana as she knelt 100 yards away, studying tracks in the dust that were invisible to him. Thomas watched her, too. He saw the way she read the land, the way her body was coiled with a constant, simmering alertness. She was a creature of this harsh world, and they were trespassers. "I think so, son," Thomas replied, hoping he sounded more certain than he felt. "I hope so. Ma always said—" "She said Indians were savages," Grace whispered, the words sounding like a betrayal on her tongue. Thomas winced. Martha hadn't been a hateful woman, just a fearful one. Her world had been small, her knowledge of the world beyond their farm gleaned from sensational newspaper stories and fearful gossip. "Your ma was afraid, Gracie," he said carefully. "Sometimes, fear makes us believe things that aren't true. Suddenly, Iana was there, appearing beside them as silently as a ghost. Her expression was grim, her eyes hard. "We have company," she announced, her voice low and urgent. "3 riders. They are on our trail." Thomas felt a spike of ice-cold dread. The bandits. It had to be them. They must have circled back, maybe to make sure there were no survivors, no one left to talk. Or maybe they were just scavengers, drawn by the smoke, coming to pick over the bones of the dead. Iana didn't seem to care about their motives. She checked the action on her rifle, the click of the mechanism loud in the desert silence. "Either way," she said, her voice flat, "they mean us no good." "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at his exhausted children, their small, sunburned faces looking to him for an answer he didn't have. Iana's gaze swept over them, then to the jagged, rocky terrain that lay ahead, a maze of canyons and cliffs. "There is a hidden place," she said, "a canyon not far from here. We can lose them there, but we must move quickly. Now." The next 2 hours were a blur of pain and exhaustion. Thomas bit his lip until it bled to keep from crying out as his reopened wound throbbed with every jarring step. The children stumbled and fell, their clothes torn to rags by thorny scrub, their faces and legs crisscrossed with scratches. But Iana was relentless. She drove them forward, finding paths where none seemed to exist, reading the contours of the land like the pages of a familiar book. She was a force of nature, pulling them along in her wake. Finally, just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red, she led them straight towards what looked like a solid wall of rock. Thomas's heart sank. A dead end. They were trapped. But it was an illusion. A trick of light and shadow created by the way 2 massive canyon walls overlapped. Iana slipped through a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, and gestured for them to follow. They stepped through the opening and into another world. It was a small, hidden valley, no bigger than a large farmstead. A gentle spring bubbled up from a cluster of limestone rocks, feeding a patch of lush green grass and a small grove of cottonwood trees. It was a secret oasis, a pocket of life hidden in the heart of death. "We rest here tonight," Iana declared, her chest heaving slightly from the exertion. "Tomorrow, we reach my people." Thomas sank to the ground, his legs giving out from under him. He looked at his children, now drinking gratefully from the spring. He looked at the high, protective walls of the canyon. They were safe, for now. But as the shadows lengthened, a new fear began to creep in. Iana had saved them from the bandits. She had led them to this sanctuary. But what would happen when they reached her people? He looked over at her. She was watching the entrance to the canyon, her rifle resting across her lap. She wasn't a savior, she was a gatekeeper, and he had no idea what lay on the other side of the gate she was leading them to. That night, the world shrank to the size of their small, smokeless fire. Iana had shown Thomas how to build it in a shallow pit, using dry wood that burned hot and clean, a trick to keep the light from being seen from the canyon rim. Thomas, his shoulder cleaned and bandaged with strange-smelling herbs from Iana's pouch, had finally succumbed to a feverish, fitful sleep. The younger children were dozed around him, exhausted beyond measure. Only Rebecca was awake. She sat across the fire from Iana, watching her. The Apache woman's hands were never still. She was weaving, her long, slender fingers moving with a mesmerizing grace, turning a handful of dried grasses into what looked like a small, intricate basket. "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said, her voice quiet in the vast silence of the canyon. "Helping us." Iana's hands didn't stop. The rhythmic rasp of the grass was the only reply for a long moment. "No," she said finally, her eyes still on her work. "I do not." "Then why?" Rebecca pressed. She needed to understand. Her world had been built on simple rules, and this woman was breaking all of them. Iana set the half-finished basket down. She looked into the fire, and for the first time, Rebecca saw the walls in her eyes crumble, revealing a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the canyon. 7 summers ago, Iana began, her voice soft, like the rustle of leaves. I had a daughter. Her name was Nalan. She was your age, maybe a little younger. Rebecca leaned forward, holding her breath. She had hair like a raven's wing, Iana continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips, and eyes like mine. She could track a butterfly across bare stone and make a flute from a river reed that sounded like a morning bird. She was my light. The smile faded. Soldiers came to our camp, bluecoats. They said we had stolen cattle from a settler. They said we had killed his family. It was a lie. We were a peaceful band. But the truth did not matter to them. The truth never matters to men with guns who have already decided who is guilty. Her voice caught, and she had to stop. The fire crackled, filling the sudden silence. In the fighting, she finally went on, her voice hard as flint. A soldier's bullet found her. She was running to me. She died in my arms. I'm so sorry, Rebecca whispered, tears welling in her own eyes. The words felt small and useless, but they were all she had. Iana took a deep, shuddering breath. The soldier who shot her. He was not a monster. He was young, scared. He had kind eyes. I remember that. After the fighting was over, I found him. He was lying by the river, dying from his own wounds. She looked up from the fire and straight at Rebecca, her dark eyes boring into the girl's soul. I could have left him there. Every part of me screamed to let him die, to let the river wash his body away. I should have let him die. She paused. Instead, I gave him water. I used the last of my medicines to bind his wounds. He lived. Rebecca stared at her, completely bewildered. Why? Later, I learned he had a wife, 4 children, waiting for him to come home. By saving his life, I saved their lives, too. By showing him mercy, I had saved his family. But I had lost my own. Iana picked up the finished basket. It was small, perfect, beautiful. She held it as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. Do you regret it? Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. Saving him? Iana met her eyes across the dancing flames. Every day, she said softly, and never. Rebecca frowned. I don't understand. You will, child, Iana said, her voice filled with a weary certainty. One day, when the world has tested your heart, you will understand. She set the basket aside and reached for another bundle of grass, her hands once again finding their rhythm. Now, she said, her voice gentle, tell me about your mother. And so Rebecca did. In the secret, fire-lit canyon, surrounded by the ghosts of her family's past and the enigma of their future, she told the Apache woman about Martha Brennan. She spoke of her warm laugh, her gentle hands, and the way she could make a simple meal of beans and bread feel like a king's feast. As she spoke, a strange and fragile understanding began to bloom in Rebecca's heart. Iana wasn't just saving them. She wasn't just being merciful. She was doing something else. She was trying to balance the scales of her own soul. The next morning brought a fresh wave of despair. Thomas's fever had broken, but he was terrifyingly weak, his skin pale and clammy. Worse, baby Samuel had developed a deep, rattling cough that shook his tiny frame and sent a spike of fear through all of them. When Iana returned from scouting their back trail, her face was a grim mask. They did not give up, she announced. They found the entrance to the canyon. Thomas struggled to sit up. How? They are not simple bandits, Iana said, checking her rifle again. They track like soldiers. They are patient. They are waiting on the rimrock. They know we cannot stay here forever. She looked at the sick child, then at the wounded man. We must reach my people. Today. Can you travel? she asked Thomas, her voice leaving no room for argument. Thomas, seeing the fear in his children's eyes and hearing the rasp of his baby's breath, gave a grim nod. "I'll travel." They broke camp in minutes, leaving no trace they had ever been there. As they slipped out of the canyon through a different, narrower passage Iana knew, Thomas looked back at the hidden paradise. It had been a sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap they had barely escaped. The journey was a nightmare. They clawed their way through rugged, unforgiving country that seemed to go straight up. Every step was a struggle. Thomas was a dead weight, leaning on Rebecca and a stoic Grace. The twins, their boyish energy finally gone, stumbled along in a daze. Iana was their anchor. She seemed to draw strength from the harsh land itself, finding handholds, pointing out safe footholds, her eyes constantly scanning the rocks above for any sign of their pursuers. Late in the afternoon, when Thomas felt he couldn't take another step, they finally crested a high ridge. Iana stopped them. "Look," she said. Down below, nestled in a wide, protected valley, was a sight that made Thomas's heart stop. It was an Apache camp. Smoke rose from a dozen or so wickiups, the traditional dwellings made of brush and animal hides. Children were playing near a stream, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. Women were working, and a group of men, warriors, sat in a council circle near the largest structure. This was it, the moment of truth. "Stay close to me," Iana warned, her voice dropping to a tense whisper. "Do not speak unless I tell you to. Keep your hands where they can see them." They began their descent. They must have looked like specters from a fever dream, the wounded white man, his 5 filthy, terrified children, and the lone Apache woman who was leading them into the heart of the enemy's camp. As they entered the valley, a silence fell over the camp. Conversations stopped. The children's laughter died. Warriors, their faces hard and suspicious, rose to their feet, their hands moving instinctively to the knives and bows at their sides. An older man, with streaks of silver in his long black hair, stepped forward from the council circle. His face was a roadmap of hard years and harder battles. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. He was clearly the chief. He spoke to Iana in the rapid, guttural clicks and flowing vowels of the Apache tongue. His tone was sharp, questioning. Iana replied in the same language, her voice calm but firm, her head held high. The exchange went on for what felt like an eternity, the Brennan family standing in a terrified, awkward silence, the focus of dozens of hostile stares. Finally, the chief's gaze fell upon Thomas. He switched to a heavily accented but clear English. "I am Cochise," he said, his voice a low rumble. "War leader of the Chiricahua. Iana tells me you are survivors of an attack. By white bandits." Thomas found his voice, though it trembled. "Yes, sir. They killed everyone else. My wife—" He choked on the word, unable to go on. Cochise studied him, his eyes seeming to strip away every pretense, every lie, and see right into his soul. "And now you seek refuge among those you would call your enemies." "I don't consider you my enemy," Thomas said, choosing his words with desperate care. "You are Iana's people. She saved our lives." "Iana has a generous heart," Cochise replied, and his tone made it clear this was not entirely a compliment. "Sometimes, too generous for this world." He looked past Thomas, his eyes lingering on the pale, sick baby in Rebecca's arms. Then he spoke again in Apache to a nearby warrior, a man whose face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a special hatred as he stared at Thomas. The warrior, who Iana called Kale, glared at Cochise, argued for a moment, then finally gave a curt, angry nod. Another woman approached and gestured for the family to follow her. "You will be given food and shelter," Cochise told Thomas, his voice flat and unreadable. "The child will be seen by our medicine woman. When you are strong enough to travel, we will hold a council." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. to decide what is to be done with you." As they were led away, Thomas saw the warrior, Kyle, watching them, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The look in his eyes was not one of suspicion. It was a look of recognition. And in that moment, Thomas knew. The danger had not been left behind in the canyon. It had followed them here, and it was wearing a friendly face. The Apache camp was a world woven from smoke, leather, and a language that sounded like the earth itself speaking. For the Brennan family, it was a waking dream, a place of deep strangeness and startling kindness. Grandmother Spider, the tribe's medicine woman, was an ancient, wrinkled creature with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 years. She took one look at baby Samuel's rattling chest, clucked her tongue, and began brewing a tea from pungent desert plants. Within 2 days, Samuel's cough was gone, replaced by the healthy gurgle of a happy baby. She treated Thomas's shoulder with a poultice of crushed leaves and mud that drew out the inflammation and left the wound healing clean and fast. The initial suspicion from the tribe began to thaw, slowly, like ice under a spring sun. The children, as children do, adapted first. The twins, Johnny and Jaime, were mesmerized by the Apache boys, who could move through the brush without a sound and hit a running jackrabbit with a blunt arrow from 30 yards. They began to follow them, silent little shadows, learning to read the stories written in broken twigs and displaced stones. Grace, ever the quiet one, found herself drawn to the elders. She would sit for hours by the fire, listening to their stories. Though she understood only a handful of words, she seemed to grasp the deeper meanings, the tales of courage, loss, and the sacred connection between all living things. Rebecca, however, formed the deepest bond. Iana took the girl under her wing. She taught her how to find edible roots, how to weave watertight baskets from yucca fibers, how to speak the flowing words of the Apache language. In Rebecca, with her serious eyes and quick mind, Iana saw the ghost of her own lost daughter, a pain and a comfort all at once. Thomas struggled the most. His skills, carpentry, farming, were useless here. He felt like a burden, a heavy, awkward weight on a people who had every reason to cast him aside. He watched the warrior Kyle, who made no secret of his disdain. Kyle treated their presence as an insult, his eyes following Thomas with a cold, simmering hatred. One afternoon, Thomas saw something that chilled him to the bone. He saw Kale slipping away from the camp, meeting with another warrior in a secluded ravine. They spoke in low, urgent tones, and though Thomas couldn't hear the words, he saw a small leather pouch exchange hands. It was the kind of pouch white traders used for gold dust. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Kale was a traitor, that the warrior's hatred wasn't just for a white man in his camp. It was the specific hatred of a man with a guilty secret. He tried to tell Iana. He found her by the stream, teaching Rebecca how to grind corn on a smooth, flat stone. "Iana, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. "It's about Kale. I saw him." "Kale is a proud warrior." Iana cut him off, her voice sharper than he expected. "His family was killed at Apache Pass. He has reasons for his anger." "This is different," Thomas insisted. "He's hiding something. I think he's in contact with the men who attacked us." Iana stopped her work and looked at him, her eyes clouded with conflict. "You are asking me to believe that one of my own people, a warrior of Cochise, is a traitor, based on nothing but your white man's fear?" The accusation stung. "It's not fear, it's a feeling. The way he looks at us." "He looks at you as I should have looked at you," she said, her voice dropping. "As an enemy." She turned back to Rebecca, her posture a clear dismissal. Thomas walked away, his heart heavy. He was trapped. The bandits were waiting outside the valley, and a traitor was living inside it. He was caught between a hawk and a snake. The breaking point came a week later. A scout, his horse lathered in sweat, galloped into the camp. He slid from his pony and ran to Cochise's wickiup. "Soldiers!" he yelled, loud enough for the whole camp to hear. "A patrol of blue coats is coming up the valley. They carry a white flag!" A murmur of alarm and excitement rippled through the people. Soldiers. The white flag meant they wanted to talk. It could only be about one thing. Them. Relief washed over Thomas, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. A rescue. They were finally being rescued. He looked at his children, their faces lighting up with a hope he hadn't seen since before the massacre. But then he looked at Iana. Her face was not relieved. It was tight with suspicion. And when he looked at Cale, he saw something flash in the warrior's eyes. It wasn't alarm. It was triumph. A new, horrifying thought took root in Thomas's mind. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. The cavalry patrol rode into the Apache camp like they owned it. There were 20 of them, their blue uniforms crisp, their leather saddles creaking, their horses big and well-fed. They were led by a young lieutenant, a man with a confident smile and eyes that seemed too old for his face. "Lieutenant Morrison," he announced, swinging down from his horse. "2nd Cavalry. We're looking for a Mr. Thomas Brennan and his family." Cochise, Iana, and a silent, watchful Thomas met him in the center of the camp. The rest of the tribe watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hostility. "I am Thomas Brennan," Thomas said, stepping forward. Morrison's smile widened. "Mr. Brennan, thank God. When we found the massacre site, we feared the worst. The whole territory has been in an uproar. We've been searching for you for weeks." The words sounded right, but they felt wrong. His horses were too fresh for a weeks-long search in this terrain. His men were too relaxed for a patrol deep in Apache country. "We're grateful for your concern, Lieutenant," Thomas said carefully, his eyes flicking towards Iana. She was watching Morrison with a stillness that was more menacing than any threat. "Of course," Morrison said, his gaze sweeping over the camp with a faint, dismissive curl of his lip. "We're here to take you home, back to civilization." It was then that Rebecca, who had been standing just behind her father, let out a small gasp. Thomas looked down at her. Her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on the lieutenant's saddle. "What is it, Becky?" he whispered. "His saddle," she breathed, her voice trembling. "The leather tooling, the little flower pattern. It's the same. It's the same as the saddles the bandits had." Ice flooded Thomas's veins. He looked from the saddle to Morrison's smiling face. A coincidence? It had to be. But then he saw it. A tiny dark stain on the cuff of the lieutenant's pristine uniform. It looked like old, dried blood. "We have supplies, wagons, a full escort to see you safely to California," Morrison was saying, his voice smooth as polished stone. "That's generous," Thomas managed to say. "It's the least we can do. After your terrible ordeal," Morrison said, his eyes finally landing on Iana. "Being held captive by these savages." The word hung in the air, an open insult. Cochise' face remained impassive, but a low growl rumbled through the chests of the warriors standing behind him. "We were not captives," Thomas said, his voice gaining a hard edge. "We were guests. Iana saved our lives." Morrison chuckled, a condescending sound. "A touching story, Mr. Brennan. One you'll have to tell the territorial governor. But I'm afraid the time for stories is over. My orders are to secure you and your family." He paused, and his smile vanished. His eyes turned to steel. "It's time to go, Mr. Brennan. Now." The rescue was an abduction. The cavalry weren't here to save them. They were here to silence them. "No," Cochise said, his voice a low thunderclap. "They are under my protection. They will not go with you." Morrison's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. His men, seeing the signal, shifted in their saddles, their hands moving to their rifles. The air grew thick, electric. A single wrong move would turn the valley into a slaughterhouse. "I don't think you understand the situation, Chief," Morrison sneered. "I have 20 cavalrymen. You have a handful of warriors with bows and arrows. This is not a negotiation." "And you do not understand the situation, Lieutenant," a new voice said. Iana stepped forward. She held the small, intricate basket she had made in the canyon. She held it out to Morrison. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Morrison glanced at it, confused. "It's a basket. It is a story," Iana said, her voice ringing with a strange power, "woven with the memory of a soldier with kind eyes, a soldier who shot my daughter, a soldier I saved from death. His name was Captain Miller." At the mention of the name, Morrison's face went white. "Captain Miller felt a great guilt," Iana continued, her eyes locked on the lieutenant. "A guilt that led him to discover a great evil. He learned that the officers at Fort Bowie, his own commanders, were stealing army supplies, guns, ammunition, food, selling them to miners, and blaming the raids on my people. He wrote it all down, letters to a federal judge in California, proof of the corruption." Thomas's blood ran cold. Martha, his sweet, unsuspecting Martha. She had been so proud of the commission she'd received from that nice Captain Miller, a simple delivery job, carry a small, sealed packet of family documents to a friend of his in California, a chance to earn a little extra money for their new life. He had it. The packet was still tucked away in the false bottom of the family Bible, the one possession he had grabbed as he fled the wagon. "Martha," he breathed. "The attack on your wagon train was not a robbery," Iana said, her voice cutting through the lieutenant's stunned silence. "It was an execution. They were there to get those letters and to eliminate the messenger, but they failed. They did not find the letters, and they left witnesses." Morrison, his face a mask of dawning horror, began to back away. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you, Lieutenant?" A man stepped out from behind the line of cavalrymen. He was not a soldier. He was a portly man in a dusty suit, his face florid and sweating. Thomas recognized him instantly. It was Silas Crane, the friendly, respectable businessman from Tucson who had sold them their wagons and supplies. The man who had wished them good luck on their journey with a warm handshake. "It seems the squaw is smarter than she looks," Crane said, pulling a pistol from his coat. He smiled, a greasy, predatory expression. "A shame we have to be so untidy. We were hoping you'd just come along quietly, Brennan." And then Thomas saw him. Standing just behind Crane, a rifle in his hands, was the Apache warrior Cale. His face was a twisted mask of guilt and fear, the pouch of gold dust, the secret meetings. It all crashed into place. Cale had been Crane's informant. He had told them where the camp was. He had sold them all for a handful of gold. "Give me the letters, Brennan," Crane demanded, "and we'll let the children live. You have my word as a gentleman." Thomas looked at the smiling killer, at the traitorous warrior, at the corrupt lieutenant and his soldiers. He looked at Cochise, standing tall and defiant. He looked at Iana, her face a carving of righteous fury. He thought of his wife, murdered for a secret she didn't even know she was carrying. He had been a farmer, a victim, a survivor, no more. "My wife is dead," Thomas said, his voice low and shaking with a rage he had never known he possessed. "You want the letters? You'll have to come and get them." Crane's smile vanished. He raised his pistol. "Wrong answer." He fired. The world exploded in a chaos of gunpowder, screams, and the thundering of horses. The battle for the valley was not a fight of armies. It was a desperate, brutal explosion of violence. The soldiers, expecting an easy abduction, were caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the Apache defense. Cochise let out a war cry that seemed to shake the very mountains, and his warriors melted into the rocks and trees, becoming lethal ghosts. Arrows hissed from the shadows, finding their marks in the throats and chests of startled cavalrymen. Iana moved like a phantom of vengeance. She dropped 2 soldiers with 2 quick shots from her rifle before disappearing into the brush near the stream. Thomas, his mind suddenly clear and sharp, shoved his children behind a large boulder. "Stay down!" he screamed, his voice hoarse. He saw Silas Crane and Lieutenant Morrison taking cover behind their horses, trying to rally their panicked men. The traitor, Cale, stood frozen for a moment, caught between his 2 worlds, his face a mess of terror and shame. Then, a stray bullet from a soldier's pistol ricocheted off a rock, kicking up dust near where the Brennan children were hiding. Grace screamed. Something inside Cale snapped. With a guttural cry of pure anguish, he turned his rifle not on the Apaches, but on the soldiers he had served. He shot one of Crane's men out of the saddle before another soldier wheeled his horse and shot Cale square in the chest. The warrior fell, his eyes finding Thomas for a fleeting second, an apology in his dying gaze. The battle raged. The twins, Johnny and Jaime, fueled by adrenaline and the lessons they'd learned, began pointing out the soldiers' positions to the Apache warriors, their small voices piping up with an eerie calm. Rebecca, her fear replaced by a cold fury, grabbed a fallen soldier's canteen and began tending to a wounded Apache, her movements quick and efficient. Thomas found a discarded pistol, its grip still warm. He was no warrior, but he was a father protecting his young. He fired at the flashes of gunfire, the recoil jarring his wounded shoulder. He saw Iana reappear on a high ledge, her rifle barking, her presence turning the tide of the skirmish on the far side of the camp. The soldiers, disorganized and terrified by the invisible enemy, began to fall back. Their superior numbers meant nothing against the Apaches' knowledge of the terrain and their desperate courage. Silas Crane, seeing his plan disintegrating into bloody chaos, made a run for it. He scrambled for a horse, intending to flee the valley and save his own skin. But Thomas saw him. With a roar of pure rage, Thomas charged. He tackled the portly man, sending them both tumbling into the dirt. Crane was stronger, heavier. He rolled on top of Thomas, his fingers clawing for Thomas's eyes. "You stubborn farmer!" Crane hissed, his face inches from Thomas's, spittle flying from his lips. "She was just a woman. You should have just died with her." The insult to Martha's memory ignited the last of Thomas's fear into white-hot fury. He twisted, using Crane's own weight against him, and slammed his fist into the man's fleshy jaw. Crane's head snapped back. Thomas scrambled on top of him, the pistol still clutched in his hand. He pressed the barrel against Crane's forehead. He saw his wife's face, her smile, her falling form. He saw his terrified children. He saw the long, lonely years ahead. He could end it. He could pull the trigger and send this monster to hell. And then he saw Iana's face in his mind. Every day and never. He lowered the pistol. "No," Thomas gasped, his voice ragged. "You're not worth it. You'll stand trial. You'll tell the world what you did." At that moment, Lieutenant Morrison, his arm bleeding and his face pale with defeat, stumbled towards them, his hands raised in surrender. The surviving soldiers, seeing their leaders fall, threw down their weapons. The battle was over. The silence that fell was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. It was filled with the groans of the wounded and the smell of blood on the dry valley air. Iana walked over to Thomas. Her face was smudged with gunpowder, but her eyes were clear. She looked down at the whimpering Silas Crane, then at Thomas. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. They had fought together, bled together, not as Apache and white man, but as people united against a common evil. Cochise approached, his face grim. He looked at the bodies of his warriors and the bodies of the soldiers. "This day has cost us much," he said, his voice heavy. "But it has bought us something too," Thomas replied, looking at his children, who were now emerging from behind the rock, safe. He looked at the captured soldiers, their conspiracy broken. "It has bought us the truth. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the family Bible. He opened it to the back and removed the sealed oilskin packet. He held it up, the cause of so much death, the seed of a new beginning. "The fighting is over," Thomas said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "But the real work is just beginning." In the aftermath, the valley became a place of strange union. The surviving soldiers were held as prisoners, their wounds tended by the same Apache women whose families they had come to destroy. Lieutenant Morrison, his arrogance shattered, confessed everything, detailing the entire conspiracy led by a corrupt major at Fort Bowie and financed by Silas Crane. The letters, the proof, were undeniable. A week later, a new delegation arrived in the valley. Not soldiers this time, but a federal marshal and a group of grim-faced men from the territorial government, summoned by a message sent by Cochise. They took Crane and Morrison away in irons. They listened, stunned, as Thomas, Iana, and Cochise told them the whole story. The world had been turned upside down. The savage Apaches were the heroes. The civilized army was the villain. Thomas and his family could have gone to California then. The government offered them a full escort, land, a generous compensation for their troubles. But Thomas looked at his children. He saw the confidence in Johnny's and Jaime's eyes, the wisdom in Grace's, the quiet strength in Rebecca's. He saw baby Samuel babbling happily in the arms of an Apache woman who had lost her own child. This valley, this harsh and beautiful land, had changed them. They weren't the same family that had left Tucson. "We're not going to California," Thomas announced to his surprised children. "We're going back to Tucson." "But why?" Rebecca asked. "Because the work isn't done here," Thomas said, his eyes meeting Iana's across the camp. "We didn't just survive something, we started something. It's time to see it through." And so they did. Thomas Brennan returned to Tucson not as a victim, but as a legend. He opened a new general store, but it was unlike any other. On one side, he sold flour, nails, and coffee. On the other, he sold intricately woven Apache baskets, beautiful pottery, and warm, durable blankets. He bought the goods directly from Cochise's people, ensuring they received a fair price. He hired Iana's nephew, Nalnish, who had learned English, to work in the store, translating for Apache customers and explaining the meaning and stories behind the crafts to the curious white townsfolk. It wasn't easy. Some people sneered, calling him an Indian lover. Rocks were thrown through his window one night. Threats were whispered. But for every person who hated him, 2 more came in, their curiosity stronger than their prejudice. His children became his ambassadors. Rebecca, now a young woman, started a small school for children of mixed heritage, teaching them to read and write in both English and Apache. The twins, with their unmatched knowledge of the territory, started a guide service, safely leading travelers and prospectors through lands that had once been considered impassable. Grace, with her love of stories, began writing down the Apache legends and histories, preserving a culture that was under constant threat. And baby Samuel grew up a child of 2 worlds, switching between languages as easily as he switched between games, seeing no walls between people, only faces. Years passed. The bridge Thomas and Iana had built, founded in blood and fire, became stronger. When disputes arose between settlers and Apaches, both sides came to Thomas. He became a mediator, a man trusted by 2 peoples who had trusted no one before. One day, 20 years after the massacre in Devil's Canyon, Thomas stood on a stage in the Grand Tucson Opera House. His hair was silver, his face was a map of desert sun and long years, but his eyes burned with the same fire. He was there to address the Territorial Convention on Indian Affairs. In the audience, he saw his family, Rebecca, the respected teacher, the twins, wealthy and successful businessmen, Grace, a celebrated author, sitting beside her Apache husband, Nalnish, Samuel, the official interpreter for the territorial government, and in the third row sat Iana. Her hair was also silver, but she sat as straight and proud as she had that first day in the canyon. After Cochise's death, she had become a leader, guiding her people through the difficult transition to reservation life, using her friendship with Thomas to negotiate for rights and dignity that other tribes were denied. Thomas began his speech with the words that had become his motto. 20 years ago, my family learned that civilization is not a place or a people, he said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. It is a choice. The choice to show mercy when revenge would be easier. The choice to build a bridge when a wall would feel safer. The choice to see the humanity in those who are different from us. As he spoke, he thought back to that day. He thought of the moment that had changed everything. The moment an Apache woman had looked at a wounded white man and his 5 terrified children and chose not to walk away. That single choice, that one act of impossible grace, had rippled outwards, touching hundreds of lives, rewriting the future for a small corner of the violent, unforgiving West. After the speech, as applause thundered through the opera house, Thomas walked off the stage and directly to Iana. They embraced, an old, comfortable friendship that had weathered decades of change. Your daughter would be proud of you, he said quietly. Iana smiled, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. As would your Martha, she replied. They see what has grown from the seeds of their sacrifice. Later that evening, as their sprawling, mixed-race families prepared to part ways, Iana pulled him aside. Do you ever wonder, Thomas, she asked, what would have happened if I had just kept walking that morning? If I had left you to die in the desert? Thomas thought for a moment, the memory of that day still as clear as glass. I think about it sometimes, he admitted, but then I remind myself that what if doesn't matter. What matters is what is. You didn't keep walking. You chose differently, and that one choice changed the world. Iana nodded slowly, a deep peace settling on her features. My grandmother used to say that we are all given moments. Moments where we can choose to be the person our pain tells us to be, or the person our heart knows we can be. And you chose to be the eternal blossom, Thomas said, using the translation of her name. You chose to bloom in the harshest season of all. They stood in the warm desert night, 2 old friends, 2 survivors, 2 bridge builders. The story that had begun with gunshots and death had become a testament to the enduring power of a single courageous choice. It was proof that the deepest canyons, the ones filled with hatred and fear, could in fact be crossed. The story of the American West is filled with tales of violence, conquest, and tragedy. But if you look closely, in the spaces between the battles and the betrayals, you can find other stories. Stories like this one. They prove that our history wasn't inevitable, and that our future is never set in stone. It is built, one choice at a time. If you enjoyed this story and believe that the courage of one person can echo through generations, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be told.